There are stories that the world watches unfold on television that feel like tales of triumph and adventure. And then there are the real stories, the ones that happen behind the cameras, in the quiet moments between takes, in the years when the lights are off and no one is watching. Drew Pritchard's story is one of those. On the surface, Salvage Hunters presented a man who knew exactly what he was doing. A dealer with an impeccable eye, charming, confident, always one step ahead of everyone else. But beneath that carefully constructed image was a man struggling with the weight of his own life, a man whose personal world was collapsing even as his professional one seemed to be expanding. This is the untold story of what really happened to Drew Pritchard, not the version edited for television. The actual story, the one filled with divorce and scandal and loss, and the kind of personal reckoning that breaks people, or transforms them. For years, the heart of Salvage Hunters was not just the antiques or the restoration projects. It was Drew and Rebecca Pritchard. They were partners in every sense of the word. They had built a business together. They had built a television show together. They had spent more than 20 years building a life together. Rebecca handled the valuations. She managed the logistics. She was the calm, steady presence that balanced Drew's restless energy. Together, they had a chemistry that was genuine and authentic. It was not performed for the cameras. It was real. Two people who respected each other, who understood the business, who had created something together that actually mattered. They scoured the United Kingdom for architectural gems and vintage furniture and rare industrial pieces. They breathed life back into forgotten treasures. They showed people the beauty that could be restored from decay. But somewhere along the way, the cracks began to show. The marriage that had seemed so solid, so foundational to everything Drew was building, started to fracture. The exact reasons were never publicly detailed, but whispers suggested that the strain of working together constantly, of living together while running a demanding business, of being constantly in each other's space both professionally and personally, had taken its toll. By 2017, after more than 2 decades of marriage, Drew and Rebecca divorced. It was not a public spectacle. It was not dramatized, but it was devastating. The divorce was not just a personal loss. It was a professional one. The dynamic that had made Salvage Hunters work, the on-screen partnership that viewers had grown to trust and love, was suddenly gone. Yet both Drew and Rebecca showed remarkable professionalism. They continued to work together on the show even after their marriage ended. They demonstrated a maturity that many people could not have managed. But everyone who knew them understood that something fundamental had shifted. The partnership that had driven the show for years was now complicated by heartbreak and resentment, and the grief of losing not just a marriage, but a shared vision. The Conway home that had been both their workshop and their sanctuary, that had represented everything they had built together, became a symbol of the life Drew was leaving behind. He had to figure out who he was without Rebecca. He had to figure out who he was without the partnership that had defined him. And so, he began the painful process of letting go. He sold large portions of his private collection. He reconsidered the direction of his business. He tried to understand what it meant to be Drew Pritchard the individual, rather than Drew and Rebecca as a unit. Friends and colleagues noticed a visible transformation. The man who had once been driven purely by the thrill of acquisition began to focus on something different: legacy, quality, personal renewal. In interviews conducted after the separation, Drew spoke obliquely about new beginnings. He talked about the need to simplify his life. He talked about stripping away the excess. Rebecca, for her part, moved on quietly. She continued her own projects in design and antiques. She maintained a dignified silence about the past. She did not weaponize the breakup or use it to build a new brand around her suffering. She simply continued to be a professional in a shared industry. For Drew, the years immediately following the divorce were the most difficult of his life. And then, something happened that made everything worse. In February 2018, just months after finalizing the divorce, Drew found himself at the center of a scandal that threatened to destroy everything he had carefully cultivated. He was involved in an altercation at a pub in Conway. The details that emerged were complicated and contested. What was clear was that it had gotten physical. Police were called. An investigation was opened. In a small town like Conway, where Drew had been a fixture for decades, not just as a television personality, but as a businessman and a resident, the incident immediately became the subject of intense speculation. The The story spread through local circles and then to national media outlets. For a man accustomed to being portrayed as the witty, fast-talking antique expert, suddenly being scrutinized for a public altercation was humiliating. The incident was eventually resolved without formal charges being filed. North Wales police reviewed the circumstances and took no further action, but the reputational damage had been done. Regional news outlets continued to discuss it. Online forums amplified every fragment of information. Local pub watch records confirmed that Drew had been temporarily banned from a group of Conway pubs. It was not a legally enforced ban, but a voluntary agreement among establishments to maintain public order. For a man who had built his professional identity in that very town, it felt like a symbolic fall from grace. What made the situation worse was that people who knew Drew understood what was really happening. This was not just about a pub incident. This was about a man in crisis, a man whose marriage had just ended, a man who was trying to figure out who he was, a man who was struggling with demons that no one had really talked about publicly. The incident was a symptom, not the disease itself. In the months following the pub incident, Drew maintained a low profile. He did not offer detailed public comments. He preferred to let time settle the narrative. The story gradually faded from major headlines, but for Pritchard, it was a moment of genuine reckoning. The experience revealed how quickly reputation could shift, how vulnerable even successful public figures were to local controversy, how fragile the carefully constructed image of his life really was. But something shifted in Drew around that same time. He made a decision that would ultimately prove to be the most important decision of his adult life. He decided to stop drinking. Not because anyone forced him to, not because the courts ordered him to, but because he understood, at some level, that alcohol was part of the problem, that the lifestyle that had seemed so exciting and rewarding in his 30s and 40s was actually suffocating him in his 50s, that the pub culture that had been such a fundamental part of who he was in Conway, the long days on the road followed by evenings spent drinking with friends and colleagues, was not sustainable. It was not making his life better, it was making everything worse. Giving up drinking was not a dramatic choice made overnight. It was a quiet commitment to self-discipline and recovery. It became the foundation for what Drew would later call his second act. In interviews given after 2021, Drew spoke more openly about that turning point. He described how sobriety had sharpened his focus and restored his energy, not just for work, but for life itself. The antiques world, he said, demands a clear mind and an eye for detail. Both things that had become clouded in the years before he quit drinking. As the noise of excess began to fade, both things came roaring back. Friends and colleagues noticed the change. Where once he had been driven by adrenaline and the thrill of the chase, he now carried a calmer confidence, an appreciation for the process rather than the chaos. He began to be more selective about the projects he took on. He stopped trying to pursue every deal, chase every opportunity. Instead, he focused on quality over quantity. The man who had spent decades darting across the United Kingdom in search of treasures became more intentional, more focused, more at peace with himself. But personal transformation was only part of the story. By 2022, Drew made another major decision. He closed the Conway showroom, the space that had been synonymous with his name for more than 20 years. The living museum filled with architectural salvage and reclaimed furniture and rare finds from across Britain. Every piece in that showroom had a story. Every corner reflected his meticulous taste. Closing it was not just a business decision. It was deeply personal. The Conway shop had been a fixture of his post-salvage hunter's identity. It was a tangible representation of his journey from local dealer to national television figure. Letting it go meant shedding part of his past. It meant releasing the physical reminder of years spent rebuilding his life after divorce and scandal. It meant accepting that the antiques world was changing. Online commerce, private commissions, and curated collaborations were replacing traditional showrooms. The old model of running a brick-and-mortar retail space was becoming obsolete. Drew began selling large portions of his stock, sometimes in sweeping clearouts that raised hundreds of thousands of pounds. These were not purely financial decisions, they were acts of release, the clearing of space for something new. His later interviews and on-screen comments revealed a man increasingly drawn to simplicity, to renewal. He talked about valuing freedom over possessions, creativity over clutter. By closing the shop, he freed himself from the daily grind of maintaining a showroom. It allowed him more time for the projects that actually inspired him: architectural consultation, restoration work done on his own terms. To his fans, it was clear that Drew was not retreating from the industry. He was evolving. The closure of the Conway showroom signaled a deliberate step toward reinvention, one aligned with the quieter, more reflective version of himself he had become. The man who had spent decades rescuing old things from decay was now doing the same for his own life, salvaging what mattered, letting go of what did not, embracing a future built not on accumulation, but on clarity and purpose. And then came the Bath project. By the early 2020s, Drew Pritchard embarked on what would become one of the most ambitious and personally revealing projects of his career: the restoration of a 5-story Georgian townhouse in Bath. The elegant but crumbling property would become the subject of a spin-off series called Salvage Hunters, the Georgian House Restoration. For Drew, whose entire life had revolved around breathing new life into old things, this was the ultimate test. A full-scale resurrection of a historic home that demanded not just taste and vision, but relentless endurance. From the very first episode, it was clear the undertaking was far larger than expected. The house, with its beautiful Georgian facade and classical proportions, hid decades of decay beneath the surface. What began as a restoration quickly escalated into a total rebuild. The roof had to be replaced. Every window frame had to be repaired or remade. The entire heating and plumbing system had to be reconstructed to modern standards while maintaining the property's 18th century integrity. Each layer of the project uncovered new complications. With every discovery came rising costs. Pritchard, ever the perfectionist, refused to cut corners. He sourced period-appropriate fixtures. He sought out handcrafted details. He insisted on historically sympathetic materials, all of which pushed expenses higher and higher. As the bills mounted, the financial strain became impossible to ignore. Viewers saw a different side of Drew, not the confident dealer closing lucrative deals, but the craftsman struggling to balance passion with practicality. The show candidly documented his predicament, the need to raise urgent funds to keep the restoration alive. In a move that surprised many fans, Drew began selling off significant parts of his private antique collection, treasures he had gathered over decades. Each item represented a story, a chapter of his life as a collector and restorer. Yet, true to his philosophy, he accepted the sacrifice as part of the process. "Sometimes you have to let go of what you have built to build something new," he remarked at one point, a sentiment that resonated with his broader journey of personal reinvention. It was not just about a house. It was about redemption. It was about proving that after everything he had endured, after divorce and scandal and loss and crisis, he could still create something of genuine beauty and meaning. As the restoration progressed, the Bath townhouse became more than a physical structure. It symbolized rebirth. For Pritchard, it was a statement of faith in craftsmanship, in perseverance, in the beauty of starting over. The bills were enormous, the work was exhausting, but the finished home stood as a testament to his resilience. In every plastered wall and hand-restored banister lay the story of a man rebuilding not just a Georgian masterpiece, but himself, one salvaged piece at a time. The tragedy of Drew Pritchard's story is not that he failed, it is that he almost did. It is that a man who had built something genuine and meaningful nearly lost it all to the weight of his own demons. The pub incident was not the end of the story, it was a turning point. The divorce was not a failure, it was a necessity. The closure of the shop was not a retreat, it was a step forward. The Bath project was not just a house. It was proof that a man can rebuild himself if he has the courage to face the truth about who he has become and the determination to become someone better. Drew Pritchard's real tragedy is that the world almost never saw his redemption because he did not dramatize it. He did not turn it into a brand. He did not use his suffering as a marketing tool. He simply lived it. He endured it. He transformed it into something beautiful. And now, in his later years, he is a different man than he was. Healthier, clearer, more at peace. A man who knows the value of salvaging not just antiques but lives, particularly his own.